Right, okay, greetings. Welcome back for the second half of our Philosophy Club meeting. And today is the 14th of January, 2022. I'm just going to run through some final points in this half, and then we'll have some questions and discussion, which we will film, I think, this time. The other boxes we need to know about, obviously we need to study the political science box. A political theory and practice is box 165 of the philosophy, boxes. And political theory, goes back to, or in different countries, goes back to different roots. But in the West, we talk about Plato's work is very important. Aristotle was the first real political science in his writings. He tried to define what kinds of states, constitutions, forms of government exist. There are monarchies, there are aristocracies, and there are democracies, said Aristotle. They can all three deteriorate, so the monarchy can become a tyranny, the democracy can become a kind of a mob rule, and the aristocracy can degenerate and become a plutocracy, whereby only the rich rule. So Aristotle thought through how we can get the best. He actually suggested we have a mixed constitution. So there'd be elements of democracy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of monarchy. And they'd all keep check on each other. So since those days, that's one of the founding core texts you study if you do political science. The concept of nationalism which comes up, there's Russian nationalists, and there's Ukrainian nationalists, and it's a sort of, that's an element in this conflict. And so when I was doing my degree at University of London, we studied nationalism in great detail. I would say it has a good element, and it also has a bad element. I think that what I call romantic nationalism, this idea that my country is wonderful and I'll help it and do my best for it, is a sort of altruistic thing. In the Polish culture, a lot of romantic nationalists, the first thing they wanted was Poland, because it had been conquered by Russia and Germany and Austro-Hungary and was dissolved as a state. I've just read a couple of very important histories of Poland. For them, just having a nation was something to fight for and work for. If you're a Palestinian, you're going to want your nation. It doesn't yet have nationhood. It has no recognition as a nation state in international law. So a romantic nationalism wanting Palestinian identity and culture is very important. And if you think of, say, the African National Congress, its struggles in South Africa, wanting a nation that everyone can be proud of, not one that's been hijacked by an apartheid few. And the same in India. The Indian National Congress wanted to create a new modern India. So these I would say these national movements have a positive element. I think there's also a dangerous and negative side to nationalism, which is what the Nazis did. National Socialism was premised on the idea of my nation is the best, the only one, the Herrenvolk, the master race, and those other nations have no right to exist, which gave Nazi Germany the horrendous idea of doing a pact with Soviet Russia, something that one would need to really understand to fully understand this war is the role of Nazi Germany. And the thing that nobody talks about, that very few historians have focused on and studied properly, is the fact that Stalin did this absolutely diabolical pact with Hitler, who was known to be against communists, because a lot of them were Jews. But he cynically did a pact with Stalin, and in September 1939, and they together carved up Poland once again. When Nazi army divisions invaded Poland from the west, Stalin's troops invaded from the east, and both of them absolutely clobbered the Poles. Stalin's NKVD went around arresting dissidents and shipping them off to Siberia. And Hitler did the same in Western Poland, and he set up Auschwitz as a Polish officer's prison camp, which I visited. His ruthlessness against the Polish people and the intellectuals was horrendous, but Stalin and Hitler were both as bad as each other in this regard. So in other words, Stalin was actually an enabler and an abettor of Hitler in the run-up to World War II. And World War II would never have happened had Stalin not supported Hitler. This is airbrushed out of history by Russian historians. This is not mentioned, it's not written about. I mean, if Gorbachev had lived and his reforms had taken root and carried on, yes, we'd be having civilized discussions. But they didn't, unfortunately. He failed, in a sense, in his liberalising mission of opening up glasnost in Russian society. So we would need to study political science in great detail. And we'd have to understand the kind of Russist ideology. Now, Russism is a term coined by Ukrainian intellectuals and historians. It's a combination word of Russian and fascist. What they say Putin's ideology is Russism. It's a sort of, it's a kind of Russia is the best power, Russia is the greatest, we have the right to invade Ukraine because we're the Russians, and you can't answer back or we'll torture you. It's Russism. And that's where they're fighting, and they know what happened last time it all went wrong. So we have to study the roots of this Russist nationalism. The roots of Ukrainian nationalism, I think, are more sober and more deep-rooted and more ethical. They go back to some deep thinkers. I've been studying some Ukrainian historians who were active in the 19th century and early 20th century, who Ukraine's an interesting place for its deep history, because it's got all these different currents. It had significant Jewish population, but also it had Tatars who were Muslims who were there for quite a long time, and it had Cossacks who were a kind of law unto themselves in the southern marches of Russia. Ukraine means the borderlands, the kind of edge lands. And even further back, if you go back to the classical age, the coast of the Black Sea, Odessa and all around there, was settled by Greeks, and there were very sophisticated intellectuals there, Scythians, Greeks, even Ovid was banished to that part of the world, the great Roman poet. So it was part of the classical world of civilized society, so to speak. So there would have been people discussing Aristotle's views, how you could run these coastal cities and so on. The other dimension of politics to understand is internationalism. So you've got nationalism, but then you've got internationalism. And I specialised as a historian in the history of integration in Europe, the founding of the European Union. When I studied at the London School of Economics, I looked into people at the end of World War II that didn't want a repeat of nationalist wars. So we founded the European Union, where nations voluntarily surrender their sovereignty and they come together and make essentially a pledge of non-aggression against each other. France and Germany had fought each other so often, so repetitively, that it was time to end that. So they created the European Union. And that came out of a whole movement of internationalism, genuine peace thinkers, but also pragmatists, realists. So Jean Monnet, who was one of the architects of it, great French intellectual who worked with de Gaulle, they thought, how can we stop this war between France and Germany that keeps breaking out every 50 years? I know, we'll create a European Union, and we'll tie our economies in so much that we can't do it anymore. And there's a whole history behind that, which should be studied, but it's not studied. It's not studied very much in British education. It's not studied in Russian education. They've ended up in this weird intellectual headspace where internationalism is the enemy. Russism is the answer. They seem to think internationalism is the enemy. And they've reverted back to the old canards, anti-Semitic canards against all internationalists are Jews, in hiding. they're all Freemasons and should all be killed off. Kind of, this is preschool mentality. No, Russian educators should actually study the history of the formation of the European Union and the United Nations, which was happening at the same time. Jean Monnet actually worked for Roosevelt. He was attached to Roosevelt's office in America, sent by de Gaulle. At the time they were thinking up the United Nations as an international organism that would stop wars in the future. And Gorbachev was a great internationalist. That's why, I supported his work and honoured it. He gave a very moving talk at the UN headquarters in New York at the second special session of the UN on disarmament. Gorbachev realised we have to disarm as a planet, or we're going to blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons. And, as a peace academic, I support that the importance of disarmament. Now, Putin seems from a totally different stable. He's destabilised the world's international system and created excuses for vast rearmaments. So now, by launching this stupid war, he's undone all the good work that was done in the 80s by Gorbachev. The other thing we need to study politics about is about racism, because there is an undoubted racial undercurrent to this war. The Russians will not accept that the Ukrainians have the right to exist as a nation. I don't mean normal Russians, I mean the cabal around Putin that have seized power. And they go on about the existential threat of Ukraine and so on. I mean, it's just total nonsense. And it's a racist ideology. Of course Ukrainians exist. I've got friends among them. They're good people. I mean, Mariupol, which has been reduced to absolute rubble, a town in eastern Ukraine, was a very, very civilized, cultured town, city, had loads of universities, students sitting around in cafes discussing Sartre and Aristotle, just like any other European city. It had theatres, music venues. It was flourishing up until this invasion. Now it's been utterly reduced to smoking rubble and loads of people killed off. That's a crime against humanity. What Putin's done is a crime against humanity. And it's a crime done in racist, for racist reasons, essentially, Russist reasons. The other thing, as I've said before, we need to understand is the history of Freemasonry, which is often blamed for everything. If you actually study Freemasonry, it's really interesting. It influenced lots of intellectuals in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Lots of the greatest Russian thinkers were, it's just, and we've talked about it in the Philosophy Club. You can't understand modern philosophy without understanding the history of Freemasonry. And I've explained in my study of Marxism that it was instrumental in helping found the best bits of Marxism. Now the kind of Stalinist mob just would shoot me for saying that. I wouldn't be allowed to say that. But it's a fact. And unfortunately, the Stalinist lot just stole a few ideas from Marx and didn't understand the cultural context. I've discovered, here's an irony of history, in my recent reading of the history of Poland by Zamoyski, I was researching Poland during the 1600s, when there was a lot of religious conflict between Catholics, Orthodox and Unitarians. Poland had a very vibrant intellectual society. And at one point a faction emerged called communists. And they were Unitarians who wanted everyone to live happily in peace. And they wanted universal salvation for everyone. That's why they call themselves communists. Now they were a religious faction in Poland in the 1600s. And that seems to be the first time the word communist ever got into European political vocabulary. I'm trying to track down exactly who they were, who were their thinkers. Because I know the term then pops up again in the 1700s here in France, communiste, to mean people who wanted a society where everyone's equal, where there's brotherhood and love and wisdom. And it certainly wasn't a materialist philosophy. It was premised on a sort of spiritual community. After all, what Christians do is we have communion every Sunday. it's a kind of what they were saying, people like Saint-Simon and other early socialist thinkers, was we should have a society that reflects those values of communionism and love, agape. And so, but whether it got from Poland to France, I don't know, by Polish emigres, possibly. People like Chopin, who was living round the corner with George Sand, it's possible. They were very deeply intellectual people, these Poles. So, Freemasonry was part of that movement because these were visionaries that wanted to make the world better by discovering the most ancient wisdom. So it's paradoxical. You go back in time to the most ancient in order to create something new that is beautiful. And so also the other thing that we need to explore is is in the pagan traditions, the light green boxes. Because there are pagans in the Ukraine. I've got friends who are saying we should go back to ancient pre-Christian roots. And there are pagans in Russia that I've met. There's a discourse going on in Europe. And as a Druid, I've met pagans throughout Europe. The ones I know are liberal, intelligent, egalitarian, ecologically minded. They're sort of pagans back to nature, let's worship the tree type of people, let's find the goddess in the garden. There's another kind of pagan that takes a different route, a more sinister route, and in the Russist form seems to be our Russian god is the only pagan god type of ideology. It hasn't got a kind of understanding that liberalism and internationalism grew out of the seedbed of genuine pagan intellectual universalism, such as I find in cosmopolitan Alexandria. Alexander was a pagan, founded that city. Some of the greatest intellects of antiquity studied and taught there, founded theosophy, and those are the kind of pagans I'd like to see in Russia. But at the moment, they seem, I don't know where they are. Speak up, please. Come out and play. And then lastly, the other box is the philosophy of science. We've talked a lot about religion, politics, and philosophy, but philosophy of science is box number 157. Marxism was an attempt at a philosophy of science, but I think it was a premature one. It didn't work. There were some great ideas in it, but it needs retesting. One of the great Marxists was a Pole called Kelish Kraus, about whom Timothy Snyder did his PhD, and he was a scientific Marxist who was a sociologist at the University in Paris here in the late 1900s. He said Marxism isn't a dogma that you impose through violent revolution. It's a methodology that you use to analyse society, which at different forms of the transformations of society may or may not be more or less useful. And to be a Marxist, you have to first of all be a social scientist who's prepared to reevaluate your theories as you go along. If Kelish Kraus and Marx are having a conversation in heaven, they'd be utterly appalled at what's being done in the name of Marxism by Stalin and his coterie. And they would be saying, yeah, let's go back to the drawing board, let's have a philosophy of science that can explain all this. And that's what I've been trying to do, just to finish with the peace science I've been working on, which is Peace Theory 166 box. And that's why I just wrote a paper about how peace theory might help, say, in African context, but also in this Ukrainian, European context. I think, if we could spend a tiny fraction of the amount that they spend at CERN on nuclear physics and on scientific weapons development, if we could spend that on peace science, we could crack these problems. So, that's my hope and prayer for humanity. We reprioritise peace, and we don't let this war take out the possibility of peace. I want to keep that vision alive for people, because I know it's possible. I was elected coordinator of Philosophers of Peace in Moscow in 1990 when Gorbachev was still president. So I'm the old school, before the Putinists sneaked back into power through the back door. And, I believe history will judge them rather badly for all what they've done. And finally, just read this book, Putin's People, Catherine Belton has written about how, the subtitle says it all, Putin's people, how the KGB took back Russia and then took on the West. You know, and she explains it in vast detail how this was done by Putin and co. And, you know, the problems that it poses are significant. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's enough from me. So any questions or notes people have taken, feel free. Now's the time.
Right. I have questions about Christianity.
Okay.
We've kind of covered Orthodox, Protestant and Catholic. And I'd like to know if there is a Christianity that is something of the sort like Bhakti or Shia Islam, which is more of a felt spirit toward these things than a particular ideology or a set of beliefs.
Well, I think that's in the more Gnostic forms that I talked about.
Okay.
And I think it's there in the mystical Christian tradition. It's there in the non-violent Christian traditions, like the Quakers that I've talked about. We had some lessons on Christianity, and we looked at the whole denominations of Christianity. So you'd find it in the Rosicrucian tradition, which was a 17th century movement for universalism. You'd find it in what I call philosophical Christianity, which is the true Christian intellectuals that want to see things, you know, from all perspectives all at once. They're working towards enlightenment. Mm-hmm. I believe that's the authentic Christian tradition. I don't think there's any one school that represents it. Like, I've met Anglicans who are amazingly enlightened. I've met Catholics who are. I've even met some Orthodox who are. And I think Protestants too. So it's Hegel called it the invisible church. Hegel said the true Christian community is in an invisible church. It doesn't have an outer building or temple structure, or it's an inner thing. And I quite like Hegel's idea of the invisible church. That's the true Christians, if you want.
So did these cats have any role in this particular?
Well, yes, we've been trying to oppose this war.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, this is what Putin has done is antithetical to that authentic Christianity. It's getting Christianity a bad name. People in other continents, China, who aren't Christian, will look at this and say, bloody Christians fighting each other, threatening nuclear war. I mean, what's got into them? I mean, this is a disgraceful thing. That's why I said Putin should immediately withdraw and retire to a monastery. I mean, it's disgraceful what he's done. It's. I don't want to sound dramatic, but it's kind of what Antichrist does. There's this tradition in Christianity that, as well as Christ, there's also Antichrist, who stands for the opposite. Mm. And it's as if Putin is playing the role of the Antichrist at the moment.
How did that fascist mentality of Ivan survive in Russia to present day? What's going on?
Very good question.
Yeah, what's going on?
I wish I knew, I think it survives through sheer fear and terror. That's how it survived in Ivan's day. And what happened was Tsars then get into power, most of them by killing the previous one. There's a tradition in Russia that you don't inherit like normal constitutional monarchy like in Britain. There's always bloodshed. So you get into power paranoid and you kill off people that are going to rival you. And then meanwhile they're looking how to kill you off. So what Russia never evolved was any kind of theory of constitutional democratic succession. And in the communist system it never really happened. Like, who's going to succeed Putin? there's nothing in writing. There's no precedence for this. What happens is each leader assumes vast power, and then normally he's killed off. And I mean, some people say that's the only solution. You know, let's hope there's a palace revolution and they kill Putin off. But to me, that just perpetuates the problem, because then they're going to have to kill off the next guy and so on and so on. What Russia desperately needs is a constitutional democracy, in my opinion, where there's an ordered succession of power. And I've been looking into this, and I don't understand why the Duma, which is the Russian parliament, is so voiceless. If this war had been done in the UK, we'd have MPs jumping up and down saying it's wrong, you know, because it obviously is wrong. And that's what parliament's for, that's what democracy is. And yet, the Duma seems powerless. I don't know where the political opposition is in Russia. I mean, what I do know is that Putin tends to kill them off, or put them in prison. A chap called Navalny, who could have been a real mouthpiece for the opposition, has been stuck in prison. And then loads of others have been killed. So he's not playing by normal rules of democracy. He's using fear and terror. And that's what they've all done. There were brief moments. One of my academic tutors, Geoffrey Hosking, who was Britain's expert on Russian and Soviet history, he did what's called the Reith Lectures, which is a main lecture that British culture does. He studied the Duma period just before World War I. Russia had a brief moment of democracy, and it was working quite well. But then World War I broke out, you know, and that was the madness and chaos which gave birth to the Bolshevik taking over of power and ending democracy. So it's a really good question, you know, but the answer is fear and terror. And also shock, destabilisation and constant warfare. That's how totalitarian regimes stay in power. They like to create chaos and mayhem. That's why they like war and invasions. You know, it's what Hitler did. He was always invading somewhere, just to keep people on their toes. And it's kind of what Putin's trying to do. As a peace person, I think it's totally out of order and should be stopped, obviously. Yeah.
Thanks for that. You mentioned, I think, a Tsarist named Catherine.
Yeah.
Who came with an enlightenment, or
Yeah, Catherine the Great.
a wall-to-wall enlightenment. I want to know a bit more about what you mean when you say enlightenment, and no damage readables.
Sure. I mean, it's a term used by historians like me to denote a certain period of intellectual history in Europe.
Okay.
The Enlightenment is one meaning of the term, and that's how I'm using it here. It was a term in which philosophy came back into its strength. Intellectuals like Voltaire and d'Alembert and others who were attached to the French Enlightenment were saying we can analyse society scientifically, we can invent new subjects. One of them was a man called Quesnay, who basically invented economics as a discipline. It was also going on in America. You had people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who we call an Enlightenment figure. He was a polymath. He was interested, as was Franklin, in science, medicine, education. He founded the University of Virginia. So the Enlightenment was die Aufklärung in German. It means the lightening up and the moving away of the clouds. I think the idea is that European history had been quite bloody and quite brutal, and they'd fought these religious wars. They'd been doing sort of psychic terrorism against each other. The Enlightenment was people like Kant was another great Enlightenment philosopher, saying let's have reason back, you know, at the centre of things. Let's discuss this stuff rationally. And the French Revolution began really out of those conversations in salons in Paris, in Freemasonic lodges, which were people coming together and discussing after the ceremony. They do ritual, but then they go, you know, and have a ceremony and a meal, and they discuss enlightened politics. And it spread to Russia at the time of Peter and then Catherine the Great. so that an intellectual class developed in Russia,
Mm.
the intelligentsia as such. And as chair of the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum, that's kind of what I represent. That's why we as intellectual network are so annoyed about this. This is history taking a stupid turning in the hands of the thugs. I mean, Putin is a thug, and his cronies too. The question is how intellectuals can block thugs from doing their thing.
Mm. Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think that you ask, how can intellectuals block thugs from doing their thing? And I think, yeah, one of the questions that's come up for me is, I mean, being a scholar of religious studies and having engaged in many spiritual teachings and practices, I'd like to know what the philosophical and spiritual implications are of this war, of all of this. It feels like this lecture has been a very informative history lesson and one of politics, and I'd like to get into the sort of like what are the implications,
Right.
Towards thought, towards
I think we've got several things all happening at once, and there are many different ways we can explore those implications. One of the things is, I think, the collusion of some Western forces in this rise to power of Putin. I've been reading and researching this a lot, and Western banks, Western industrialists have been happy to receive Russian cash and turn a blind eye to what Putin's doing. He's been breaking the rules of international finance even. And, it's easy to bribe people is one of the lessons we learn here. People in Germany have accepted money from Putin, and in Britain, my country in Britain was basically corrupted by Putin's vast wealth through KGB operatives who persuaded Britain that Brexit was a good idea, which is, like, as most proper intellectuals in Britain would tell you, it's a catastrophe. But by using the social media to turn people into, screaming revenge artists, they created this idea that it's good. It was a social media operation. So one of the lessons is you've got to stay uncorrupted. This is, really, really important. Don't accept bribes from dark gangsters. That's one lesson. The other lesson is the dangers of social media. It was manipulated brilliantly, as Tim Snyder's book, The Road to Unfreedom, explained, not just in Brexit, but in America. In Trumpery, Trump was a Russian asset. I mean, it's scandalous, but true. And through the manipulation of people's public opinion on the internet, which is a new phenomenon, philosophers like Kant and Rousseau, they didn't have to bother about the internet. My generation, we have to think through its implications. It seems like a good idea. It amplifies everybody's voice. We're all Democrats. We can all say, what we want and all that. But it's having terrible consequences, because what turns out in the internet space, you can buy it. So if I spend $1 million on Twitter accounts, create 1,000 fake Twitter accounts, I can destroy somebody's reputation. I mean, I've been watching the Harry and Meghan saga. Harry and Meghan stood up against racism in Britain. They stood up against racism implicit in the royal family. They stood up for Africa. They stood up for the black community in Britain. And they were consciously targeted with fake Twitter accounts to destroy their reputation. Saying things like, Meghan's a witch, she's a black bitch, they're going to have monkeys as babies. And this was a Twitter deliberate campaign against good people, bought and paid for by money. Now that's what we're up against, and this is a new phenomenon. I think the answer is